Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my Spec Spotlight for the Unholy Death Knight. This is the series where we take a look at specs and talk about their strengths and weaknesses and what to expect if you see one in your Mythic Plus group. Let's start off by talking about Unholy Death Knight's pros and cons. Unholy Death Knights are very good in terms of damage, especially in their cooldowns, and especially in big pulls. That's because they can do something that's called quadratic scaling, which is for each extra target that you pull while they're in their cooldowns, they deal more damage to every other target as well that's in the pack. And that can be really, really strong. So if you pull 10 mobs, they can do, a big amount of damage. If you pull 20 mobs, they can do unreal damage to all 20 targets and just destroy them in a couple globals. The reason for this is because of mostly of bursting sores, which means that when they burst a festering wound, they also deal damage to all nearby targets. So each extra enemy, when they're in their cooldowns, they're going to be applying their festering wounds and bursting them on all the targets. So each extra enemy there will be an extra wound to deal damage to everything and be an extra target for all the damage from all the other wounds being burst. So they just do huge damage. They also generally play Epidemic in bigger keys, or they can even play a more quadratic scaling talent for just for their cooldown window, for their Death and Decay. That's something you'll see mostly in MDI keys, though. Cons of the Unholy Death Knight. Generally, they require this setup to be good at damage. They're not really that good if you pull, like if you just pull 3 mobs and then a couple, 30 seconds later you pull another 3 mobs, and then 30 seconds later you pull another 3 mobs. They're kind of unwieldy. They need to be doing all their stuff. They can't really just do half of their cooldowns and do anything really effective in AoE. So mostly they require at least, using cooldowns on a medium-sized pull to be effective. They also have very low mobility. It's a spec that has a hard time getting from point A to point B quickly. And there are some boss fights where that means they need to be played pretty well to avoid dying to avoidable stuff. Okay, let's take a look at the different utility abilities that an Unholy Death Knight brings. The first and most powerful one, I'd say, is Death Grip. Death Grip is extremely good in a couple of specific dungeons. Like in the Motherlode, it's at its best because it lets you pilot extra Peacekeepers. You can grip jockeys to faraway Peacekeepers, and they'll pilot them, so that's really, really strong. But it's also good in a lot of dungeons, Toldagor, grouping mobs up, and it's just great against emissaries, like gripping at the start of a pull, the Death Knight can just grip out the Enchanted Emissary, and then you all can run into the pull, and the Enchanted Emissary is 30 yards away or whatever, and not a problem. Or gripping out a Tide's Emissary, and then allowing the group to kick or stun whatever cast is happening. Those are very, very powerful things that an Unholy Death Knight can do with Death Grip. They also have a Battle Res. They do need some runic power to cast this, so they can't always do it immediately, depending on what their rotation is looking like. But the fact that they do bring a B-Res is very powerful, especially if you're not playing with a Resto Druid. Generally, a lot of groups do have a Resto Druid, but outside of that, Unholy Death Knight is one of the classes highest up in the metagame that does bring a Battle Res. Anti-Magic Shell is another ability they have that allows them to absorb a bunch of magic damage, but also, crucially, while it's active, they're immune to many different magic or poison or whatever effects that would otherwise be applied to them. So you can use this in all sorts of dungeons to prevent the application of various effects. Like Rixa Flux Flame in the Motherlode, for instance, you can run under her in AMS when she's about to do Chemical Burn, and none will be applied to you. Or Bursting, when Bursting is going out, you can AMS before Bursting starts, and none will be applied to you. It's important to note that if the AMS gets damaged through and gets removed, then you lose that magic immunity, of course. So, if you try and AMS when you have 7 stacks of Bursting, it'll go away in a tick or two, and then the 8th stack of Bursting can be applied to you. But if you AMS when you have 0 stacks of Bursting, you're going to take no damage and have no Bursting stacks applied to you for as long as it holds. Death Knights can and often do talent into a stun. There is another good option on that row, like a slow on their Death and Decay, so that is something to be aware of that they may take. But otherwise, the option is Asphyxiate, which is a nice ranged, targeted, single-target stun. Chains of Ice is an ability they have. It's a single-target slow, but it is a very potent slow. This can be useful if your tank is kiting, if there's some mob that's really going to beat them up, like an Emissary of the Tides or something that you need to slow. That can be a useful thing to use in a pinch, although not an ability I'd say that gets pressed all that often in most keys. They also have a stun on their pet. This one, if you're playing with Pug Death Knights, there's a good chance they don't have their pet stuff bound. They just have pet things on autocast or whatever, so their pet just might be randomly stunning things when it comes off cooldown, or may just never cast stun. But if you're playing with a Death Knight who's really keyed into their character and knows all their stuff, their pet can also stun for them on demand. They do have a good interrupt as well in Mind Freeze that can be cast at range. And while their pet is in Dark Transformation, which is one of their damage cooldowns, their pet also gains an interrupt. So under rare circumstances, that can be used in a planned fashion. Generally, that's not, it's a pretty hard thing to line up, but you know, it can matter. There's something to be aware of. Death Knights can also taunt, which is it's always useful to have people that can taunt in your group, especially on weeks like Necrotic Week. Although Death Knights aren't one of the specs that can, like, immune things after they taunt. They can heal themselves up, though. They can use their defensives. They can use AMS if there's, like, if they want to taunt an Emissary of the Tides and take a hit or something. For some reason, that is something they're allowed to do, and the AMS will work against the magic damage auto attack of the Emissary of the Tides. And they can do pretty reasonable self-healing with Death Strikes, especially while they're in their defensive. So this can allow them to do a reasonable job of tanking something for a little bit if need be, maybe long enough to let a tank reset Necrotic under the right circumstances. Although, you know, this is much sketchier than, say, a Havoc Demon Hunter doing it with Netherwalk, or, you know, a Paladin doing it with Bubble or something. Unholy Death Knights can also cast Control Undead, which lets you take control of various undead enemies, mostly Ataldazar and King's Rest is where we're looking at, like, reanimated Honor Guards and Ataldazar, or enemies from the bridge before the third boss in King's Rest. This isn't a good thing for Unholies to do as part of the plan, because then they'll lose their ghoul, and that is a really big problem for Unholy Death Knights, so it's not actually something that you should plan for as part of your, you know, your strategy going into the dungeon with an Unholy Death Knight. But if need be, you know, if your group's wiping or something and you need to reduce the damage incoming, or if you pull an extra pack or something, you can use the Control Undead effects from the Unholy Death Knight. Just know that they are going to lose damage for as long as you're forcing them to control an undead. And finally, they do have a couple of pieces of mobility. They're generously called mobility. Death's Advance one that notably makes them immune to, like, knockback effects, so sometimes that can matter if there are effects like that, and then they can also play Wraithwalk. Let's talk about the builds of Unholy Death Knight, so the essences, traits, and trinkets you're likely to see. By far the most common build is Blood of the Enemy Major, so that does require a PvP grind. It's not something that's worth using until you get to rank 3. Like, if you don't have rank 3 of this, you probably should play, I don't know, Focusing Iris or Crucible or Condensed Life Force or something, but it's going to be a lot worse. And then the minors you'll play, usually Conflict and Strife is a nice and flexible one that just gives you some pure stats, so very nice there. And Memory of Lucid Dream's good for the refund on the resources. The most important Azurite trait for Unholy Death Knight is Festermite, a strength buff they gain when they pop a Festering Wound. This is because that synergizes nicely with their big AoE setup, in which they're popping a bunch of Festering Wounds. So they'll get just huge amounts of strength from popping all those wounds in those big AoE situations. The other good trait for Unholy Death Knight is Magus of the Dead. Both of these traits are just ones that you want as much of as possible. Magus of the Dead just means that their Apocalypse and Army of the Dead bring along a spellcaster that happens to do quite a lot of damage. And then outside of that, you just want, you know, any stat stuff or overwhelming power pieces, resounding protection pieces, the usual kind of nonsense. One of the best trinkets for Unholy Death Knight is actually the Rage from King Mechatork. Obviously, it's hard to get this item in high eye level. You have to get lucky and have it Titan Forge or something. But if you happen to be clearing Mythic Dazar lore, bring your Death Knight if you have a choice and try and get this item from Mechatork. It synergizes very nicely with the Unholy Burst window. It gives them a lot of stats right in their Death and Decay and their big AoE, and so that works really well in keys. From Eternal Palace, they can also use Azhara's Font of Power. Again, similar, this works well with any spec that is cooldown dependent, that does a lot of damage in, you know, burst windows and then takes some time where they do less damage. Unholy likes that. You know, you can channel this font. It's a little bit less perfect than it is for some other specs because Unholy's, you know, cooldowns don't exactly always follow a 2-minute cadence, but you know, it still works great for when there are about to be a very big pull or whatever. The Vial of Animated Blood also works pretty well for them because, again, that works nicely in their short burst window. And then failing all that, the Butcher's Block, a nice Mythic Plus trinket, strength trinket that happens to have quite a lot of stats on it relative to most of the other strength trinkets you can find, which tend to be a little bit worse than the agility trinkets so far this X-Pack. Unholy Death Knight is a spec that I think might see a lot of play coming next season. I think it does a lot of damage, and especially once emissaries are gone and people are pulling big again, I think it might be Unholy's time to shine, so look out for it. I hope you enjoyed this little spotlight into how the spec works. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if there's any classes you'd like to see up next. Remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.